In this presentation, we're going to consider Latin American geography. Or in other words, we're going to set the scene for what we will be studying or where we will be studying for the rest of the term. So as we think about Latin America as a region, in terms of its human and physical geography, there are a few questions that we should consider right off the bat. First and foremost, where is Latin America? What is this place that we're talking about? And to help us think about that, we need to consider something that geographers really work with. And in the geography assignment, I've put a couple of links to key articles from geographers about thinking of the relationship between space and place. So what makes a space like this one on the globe into a place that we know as Latin America? Who calls it Latin America as well? Do most people within the region think of themselves first and foremost as Latin Americans, Latinoamericanos, or do they think of themselves primarily as Mexicanos, Chilenos, etc.? Also, we need to think about what particular characteristics in terms of human, historical, physical, and other types of geography unite the nations of Latin America. So that's kind of the big question that we're getting at with all of this. How can we even call this Latin America? What makes all of these things united in some way, shape, or form? Of course, the area of Patagonia, very different than this region here in Central America. How are they part of the same place, or are they? I mean, is this construct of Latin America useful, and what are its limitations? Also, there are certain people who study Latin America who don't necessarily count all of the Caribbean islands as part of the region. Most would include Cuba and the Dominican Republic. Others don't. So we have to think about why that might be the case. How should we approach the study of this area? So let's jump into this question of what makes a space into a place. And there are a number of different things that will help to accomplish that. But I want you to look at this map. And you might be saying to yourself, that's a map. Look at it for just a minute and think about where this is. What is this place that is being presented to you? Is it just a squiggly line that someone with kind of poor handwriting wrote out real quickly? What is this thing? Now that you've had a moment to think about it, maybe you already know what this is. If not, this is one of Christopher Columbus's earliest maps of Hispaniola, or the island that is today Haiti and the Dominican Republic. You'll notice there's not much to it. It doesn't show a lot of places or people. It looks like a squiggly line that he labeled La Hispaniola. That has to do a lot with his limitations of knowledge. So another thing we have to think about as we approach our study of this region, we think about travel logs. As outsiders, we see certain things that people who are residents of Latin American places maybe already know or they don't divulge. We also can only explore what we can explore. We have limitations to our knowledge of the region. This was painfully obvious with the first European maps of the place for a number of reasons. Their technology was not what it is today. So they had to actually travel the coastal regions or the coastal lines of these places in order to draw maps of them. But again, it just really helps us to think about the limitations of their knowledge and how it built slowly over time. And again, what their relationship to the people was. This is a hopefully reoccurring theme from Unit 1 as we think about what our relationship is to Latin American places and people. So within the span of a couple centuries, we can see that Europeans' geographic knowledge had grown tremendously. So here's a map of Hispaniola. Then it had a French colony of Saint-Domingue, Spanish colony of Santo Domingo on the other side of it. This is the island of Puerto Rico, and we can see Cuba over here. If you compare this to a Google Earth map or a more recent map of this island, you'll notice that it still looks a bit distorted. Our ability to represent geographic space, physical spaces, wasn't what it is today. And I have these links. Let me just point out here. I'll give you the slides that aren't narrated as well, so that if you want to follow any of these and look at the original sources or do more research, you can do so. But I just like old maps, and I like to see the progression of how these spaces turned into places. So mapping is one way of making a space into a place. We label it in certain ways. Alexander von Humboldt, who I've promised we'll talk about a bit in our reading and so on, was one of the first to observe. Let me back that off. He was one of the first Europeans to systematically observe Latin America in terms of drawing maps, bringing back samples of flora and fauna, and thinking about the region very systematically. There's a portrait of him in 1806. He made most of his travels through Latin America already by that point in time. He started his travels in 1799 with the blessing of the King of Spain at the time. And the King of Spain most liked the idea that he would go and complete more mapping and scientific knowledge of Latin America, which was then mostly Spanish America, not all, of course. But he liked the idea that Humboldt was willing to finance his own expedition. This is a map that, as you can read, it's part of the Orinoco system in Venezuela today, that was based on Humboldt's observations. So the point of thinking about travel logs is that outsiders, we can come to know the places that we will be studying. We can know them pretty extensively. We won't be able to actually go there and observe, but through our reading, through maps that we can look at online and so on, we can come to know these places as long as we have a cultural sensitivity that the Europeans of the 19th century really didn't have. And we can understand that we're outsiders, we're observers. We're trying to learn something about a people and a place that already exists. What makes this a place to the people that live there? How do they define it? What are their cultural cues? These weren't always questions that the writers of 19th century travelogues would have asked, but they are questions that we need to think about in terms of how this region has become what it is today. So on this slide, I have a couple of maps, and I want you to just take a moment, pause the video or not if you don't want to, but think about Latin America as it's presented to you here in this physical map, and then this map from Google Earth shows the boundaries of the modern nations that comprise the region. How many of these can you label? Which of these places can you identify? So take just a minute and see what your current knowledge is of this place. And if you wanted to pause it, you would have, so I'll just move on. Here's the physical map filled in with some key areas. Of course, this is not extensive or comprehensive by any means, but it gives us some of the key areas in Latin America that we could identify. You've probably heard of the Yucatan Peninsula, which is part of Mexico, of course. Panama Canal actually runs north and south here, even though it was made to connect east and west from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. And again, you can look through these and think about, have I heard of this place? What does it look like? If you're wondering what areas you might want to include in your tour of Latin America and you don't really know, you can use these maps or the maps that are included at the end of the geography assignment to give you some ideas. And here is the political map. So if you can see how many of these you knew on your own in terms of the nations and major cities of Latin America. Of course, we'll get into this more in coming weeks. Brazil was primarily settled by Portuguese conquest. The French and the Dutch settled many of these places, Guyana, Suriname, and French Guiana. The Dutch also had a foothold in Brazil for a time. The British, the Dutch, and the French had islands here, as well as the Spanish. And then much of the rest of this area was conquered and claimed by Spanish colonists. Of course, all of that was predated by indigenous peoples who had their own maps of this area, sometimes written down, sometimes not, sometimes passed down through oral traditions and oral knowledge. But they knew these places, they knew these rivers, they knew these mountains. They had very deep and even spiritual connections with these places And many of them still do. Many of their descendants are still here. That's something important to keep in mind also as we study Latin America. Indigenous peoples are not the past. They're the present as well. They have endured centuries of colonialism and colonization, and their cultures have been shaped by that experience, but they've also been very resilient. They've pushed back and shaped the unique culture that has come out in Latin America as well. And the last few slides, just because I get really into historical maps, so I wanted to show you a few of these, just so we can think about the ways in which our geographical knowledge depends on the extent to which we talk to other people, our time and our place, our technology, and our understandings of cultures that exist in the places that we want to present in map form. Getting a lot of emails right now. This one was a German map of Munster's 1540 that was attempting to create a world map like Ptolemy did centuries earlier. But this one is showing the Americas. You can tell, again, how far our knowledge of this has come. This is essentially Mexico. This would be Baja California. There was not an understanding, at least early on, that it connected to North America. Much of that knowledge had to come through expeditions that people led over land. So, for example, Coronado's expedition in 1540, the time this map was published, helped to fill in the map in this area here. Oñate's later colonization of New Mexico, so to connect this back to New Mexico history and the place that this area that we live in had in Latin American history and culture, all of that was kind of built out, at least as far as European maps of the areas went through those travels. Here's a 1587 map of the Americas, and if you follow this link, it'll take you to David Rumsey's map collection, which is super extensive, a rabbit hole you could spend hours and hours in if you're interested in historical maps. But this one, I mean, it probably looks far more recognizable than the last one in terms of North America and South America. It still looks quite distorted compared to our current understandings of geography. But we can see the Gulf of California here. We can see that the Baja Peninsula is connected to North America. We can see that Brazil is already labeled on this map. This is a different kind of map, obviously, a modern projection of the world that shows the extent of the Spanish Empire. The blue is the Portuguese Empire as well. So interestingly, even though Brazil is one of the largest countries in the world in terms of its physical geography, the extent of, just delete that one, the extent to which the Portuguese actually settled was right here along the coast. They didn't control much of the interior regions. This was something that was true in many places, even in the Spanish Americas, although this is filled in red. There were a lot of indigenous people that were able to control the peripheries and the interior areas because they were kind of outside of the grasp of the colonizers. Looking at maps can help us to kind of understand how the cultures developed, why certain indigenous cultures in certain places were the ones that seemed to be more resilient, and so on. And of course, this helps us to see, here's the present-day nation of Spain, Portugal in blue. These were, small areas in the Iberian Peninsula that controlled extensive swaths of land across the world. All of these little outposts were Portuguese holdings. The Portuguese had kind of a different model of colonization, at least initially, than the Spanish. They set up trading posts. They didn't immediately set out to try to control territory the way that the Spanish did. So again, just something that you can get from maps. You could take very different lessons as well from this map. These maps show the viceroyalties of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. This other map shows the breakdown within viceroyalties of these jurisdictional units called audiencias. Viceroyalties are what they sound like. They were kind of the vice kingships of different chunks of the Spanish Empire that were ruled by viceroys. This was the way that the King of Spain kept his authority and control throughout this place. He also split these places up into, there were mostly judicial units known as audiencias, but the people who led the audiencias often had authority that would challenge that of the viceroy. The point of all of this is, in a time without the kind of technology that we have at present, the King of Spain, at least in the early years of the empire, created this set of overlapping jurisdictions so that people might fight with each other over final decisions to be made. They would then have to appeal to the king and help him all the way over there in Madrid to maintain his authority over these places. Similar patterns also took place in Brazil and Guyana and some of these places that were controlled by other European powers. And again, these maps help us to see those jurisdictions as well. Finally, these are more recent maps, well, at least one of them. They're recent projections of the geography that we know. This one of the world, well, you can think about what it shows for a second. You may already have an idea about that. It shows the migrations of the first humans out of Africa and beyond and how long it took. So this shows the peopling, the initial peopling of the Western Hemisphere, of the Americas. This is a completely different map, of course, which shows the places that people apprehended by the U.S. Border Patrol originated from in Central America. So with that recent kind of influx of Central American migration to the United States, mostly because of violent conditions in places like Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala, that we can again use maps to help us think about where did these people come from and in what numbers, and so we can zero in and say, well, what's going on in that place? This one over here shows us a few different things in terms of maquiladoras and economic production throughout Latin America. I don't really have anything specific to say about these, but I just wanted to give you a survey of the types of maps that we have so that we can consider how could we use maps to help us think about how a space has turned into a place, and why do we also need local knowledge about that, local culture as well. Hopefully you'll keep those questions in mind as you complete your geography assignment for this unit.